They were young German soldiers fed a steady diet of propaganda that promised a weak, starving America, a nation ripe for collapse. But for one prisoner in California, that lie was shattered not by a tank, but by a single sight, a butcher shop window overflowing with meat, revealing a truth more powerful than any weapon and all the enemy's armies. The black water of the Atlantic was a constant menace outside the porthole, but the real storm raged inside the mind of Klaus Richter. He was 21, a veteran of the Wehrmacht's last stand, convinced he was sailing to his ending in the enemy's hands, expecting unimaginable suffering and hardship. Below deck, the stench of oil, sweat, and fear hung thick and nauseatingly close. For weeks, the cargo ship carried hundreds of prisoners toward a land they had been rigorously taught to despise. To Klaus, the United States was a fragile, collapsing empire, a land of factory slaves, starving workers, and decay. Every poster hammered home the same message. America was weak, corrupt, and on the brink of economic collapse, a place of ultimate humiliation designed by criminals. Klaus, raised on the rigid certainty of the Hitler Youth, believed it all completely and without question. He expected a prison built of vengeance, fueled by hatred and brutal punishment directed at every captive. When the ship finally docked near California, the first sight delivered an unexpected shock. Instead of crumbling docks and poverty, they saw a massive, flawlessly organized port, a relentless engine of industrial might that seemed terrifyingly efficient. From the docks, they transferred to slow-grinding trains headed inland. Packed into guarded boxcars, the prisoners had their first real glimpse of the vast American interior. They were expecting poverty, but as the train rumbled into the fertile heartland, evidence of a different reality began to accumulate. The train passed through small towns that looked impossibly clean and prosperous, flourishing under the sun. The fields seemed limitless, stretching to the horizon under a soft blue sky, showing incredible fertility. They saw barns bursting with hay and silos towering high, overflowing with grain, a spectacle of total abundance. This casual, thoughtless abundance was the first crack in Klaus's armor. The propaganda had been so specific. Yet every mile was carrying him deeper into effortless wealth, a shocking and unsettling sight that defied reason. The fear of being beaten was replaced by a more insidious emotion, confusion, deep and difficult to reconcile. The train finally slowed, brakes shrieking in the warm California air. They were pulling into the city of Stockton, near the boundary of a prisoner of war camp. Klaus braced himself for the shouts, but beneath the fear, the terrifying seed of doubt about his leaders had taken root. The gate hissed open, not with a military crash, but with grinding gears, revealing an orderly, almost boring landscape of barracks and swept roads far from the brutal conditions expected. Instead of shouting, Klaus heard a bizarre sound, a baseball game on a distant radio, signifying strange peace and leisure. Klaus stepped out of the boxcar, his knees weak from tension. He stood rigid in the California sun, waiting for the inevitable shout. Instead, an American officer spoke in measured tones, outlining the Geneva Conventions with cool formality. The prisoners listened as they were informed of their rights, medical care, mail, and a decent ration, all strictly enforced even for enemies. It was so clinical, so utterly devoid of rage or triumph, feeling entirely unnatural. Inside the barracks, the shock deepened. The bunks were clean. There was electric light, running water, and plenty of soap, everyday items now seeming like unimaginable riches. That evening, Klaus stared at his first meal in Camp Stockton, a thick stew rich with potatoes and a slice of honest white bread, far exceeding their rations at home. The sheer abundance of the 3,200 calories provided daily was a profound blow to his indoctrination. He ate slowly, convinced the food must be tainted with some kind of poison or trickery. The guards were consistent. They were firm and watchful, but not cruel or vengeful in their demeanor. This wasn't a punishment camp. It was an efficient, pragmatic system designed for logistics. Because America's young men were overseas, there was a desperate shortage of labor for farms and industries. The solution was to put the prisoners to work, which was both legal and economical for the region. Klaus and others were soon chosen for a labor detail outside the camp's main fence, a daily assignment into the civilian heart of Stockton. The foreman, Mitch, was introduced. Not a uniformed guard, but a regular man in denim work clothes. As Klaus climbed onto the pickup truck, the final realization settled in. He was being sent outside the wire with almost no armed escort. This trust, this baffling lack of fear from the enemy, was the final insult to the propaganda machine. The truck rattled out of the main gate, leaving the illusory safety behind. Klaus had been told the enemy was starving. He was about to see a single butcher shop that held more meat than his entire town had seen in 2 years, completely crushing his faith in the Nazi state. The engine of the old Ford pickup sputtered to life, and as it pulled away from the main camp gate, the wire fence, the only true symbol of Klaus's captivity, began to shrink. This was the moment the cruel, true nature of America was supposed to reveal itself to the shocked young man, but the terror was missing. The only other man in the cab was Mitch, the foreman, whose total indifference to the great European war was unnerving. Mitch, in his dusty boots and faded denim, drove with one elbow resting on the open window, chewing slowly on tobacco, completely at ease. He drove the German prisoners as one might transport tools, with a casual, businesslike practicality that was utterly bizarre to a trained soldier. The destination was a large, overgrown storage yard on the edge of downtown Stockton, California. The work itself was honest, hard labor in the intense heat of the Central Valley, but the true source of Klaus's anxiety was the environment, the unguarded freedom. There were no armed towers, no guard patrols, and the nearby street was only a few dozen yards away, clearly visible. Klaus and his fellow prisoners worked under the open sky. The true tension came from the freedom of movement they were granted, an unthinkable leniency for captured soldiers. Mitch assigned the tasks, showed them how to use the tools, and then simply stepped back, only occasionally watching their slow progress. Mitch's logic was simple and pragmatic. Ain't no point running. You stay, you work, you get fed, you run, you face a terrible fate out in the desert. This utter lack of fear that the prisoners would escape was deeply unsettling to the devout prisoner. As the days turned into routine, Klaus focused less on the trap and more on the reality of the street. He observed the civilians of Stockton. They drove an impossible number of shiny private automobiles. They walked to work with an assured, steady gait, their movements unhurried and confident. They carried bags overflowing with goods, not the meager, rationed bundles of German citizens. The constant rumble of civilian prosperity contradicted everything he had been taught. He found the quiet, baffling efficiency of people living a life of comfort and endless resources. Klaus leaned on his shovel, wiping the sweat from his brow. The longer he watched the American street, the more unstable his beliefs became. He knew they were due for another trip into the town proper soon, and that the casual reality of Stockton was preparing to deliver a truth far more powerful than any weapon, shattering his loyalty and his worldview forever. The old pickup truck rattled to a stop, not at an army base, but directly on a busy civilian corner in downtown Stockton. The reason was mundane, a simple errand, but for Klaus, the abrupt immersion into American normalcy was a sensory explosion of sound and color. Stepping out onto the curb, Klaus felt dizzy, not from the heat, but from the dazzling spectacle of the street. He expected the drab, utilitarian uniformity of a struggling society. Instead, he found a bustling hub of effortless commerce and vitality. The colors were the first shock: bright reds, yellows, and blues on signs, all set against the gleam of chrome and polished glass dazzling his eyes with their extravagance. The constant hum of traffic was overwhelming. Here were hundreds of private cars moving with an absurd ease and consuming vast amounts of fuel. They were long, sleek, and massive, consuming gasoline that Klaus knew was considered liquid gold in Europe, desperately rationed. Each vehicle refuted the core German claim of American exhaustion. Klaus's eyes darted from detail to detail, unable to find a flaw in the infrastructure or the faces of the citizens. The sidewalks were clean, the buildings well-maintained, and the people moved with a casual confidence. They were plump, unhurried, and richly dressed, showing no signs of strain. He noticed a small thing that struck him, A young boy tossed the uneaten half of an apple into a trash can. The casual waste of fruit, a piece of food that had been an annual treat in Germany, was a staggering revelation of American abundance. To Klaus, this simple act felt like a profane display of wealth, almost sacrilegious. Mitch, oblivious to the internal crisis, pointed to a department store window. The glass showcased an impossible array of electrical goods, radios, large fans, shiny kitchen appliances. For the German family, such items had been purely aspirational for many years. Here, they were displayed as everyday commodities bought with simple currency and easily available. Klaus realized the enormity of the lie he had lived. The reality of downtown Stockton, the sheer unbridled prosperity, suggested an industrial machine operating at a level that utterly dwarfed Europe's output and war machine. The truth hitting Klaus felt like a physical weight, crushing his certainty and national pride. Mitch waved him over, pointing down the street toward a corner shop with a large glass display. The destination, a local butcher shop, was about to deliver the final, undeniable proof that the war propaganda was entirely false and without merit, causing total cognitive dissonance. The air changed abruptly, filling with a rich, metallic, and utterly overwhelming scent that stopped Klaus cold. It was the smell of freshly cut meat, not the faint, rationed scent of a single bone, but the dense, powerful aroma of animal abundance, shockingly strong and intoxicating. Mitch led the small work detail to the corner where Stockton Meats and Provisions stood. It was the window's contents that delivered the true devastating blow to Klaus Richter's reality. He pressed his face against the glass, staring into a scene of such reckless, casual plenty that it should have been a fever dream from another world, impossibly real. Inside, the counter was a cathedral of unrestricted protein. Hanging from hooks were massive, glistening sides of beef, fat marbleized and pale. Glass cases showcased towers of tightly rolled sausages, thick coils of bacon, and cuts of pork shoulder that easily outweighed a German family's monthly meat ration, if they even got one. Klaus had lived under the strict rationing of the Reich. He had been taught that the American populace was enduring far worse. Yet here, a single butcher shop displayed more meat than he had seen in the entire year leading up to his capture, confirming his deepest fears. The quality was another shock. The beef was deep red, glistening with fat, a sign of feeding and care untouched by war. It was not just food, it was a monument to surplus, laid out for anyone to buy without restrictions. Working behind the counter was the butcher, Mr. Jensen, whose stomach strained his apron. He greeted customers with an easy, slow cheerfulness. They did not beg for rations, they bought large, casual amounts of food, paying with ease and without haste. Klaus watched a woman ask for 5 pounds of ground beef for a casual dinner. That quantity alone was impossible to imagine for private consumption back home. Mr. Jensen was treating this resource with the same indifference one might use to stack newspapers, showing utter disregard for the scarcity of war. The foundation of Klaus's indoctrination, the belief that America was starving and weak, collapsed on the sidewalk. He felt profound humiliation not by his captors, but by the leaders who had sent him to fight against a power they had so comprehensively underestimated and lied about. Klaus felt physically sick, the rich smell of abundant meat wrapping around him. He stood paralyzed, the undeniable reality of the butcher shop having destroyed his entire belief system, leaving him utterly adrift in truth and deep confusion about his country. Klaus stood motionless, his mind reeling from the sight of the butcher shop window, unable to move past the profound realization that everything he had risked his life for was built upon a grotesque fantasy. It was in this moment of internal collapse that Mitch finally called him over for the simple task of carrying a box. "Hey, German, grab this box." Mitch pointed to a heavy wooden crate. Klaus, snapping back to reality, moved toward it. He expected Mr. Jensen to object, perhaps shouting at the enemy, but the butcher merely watched the proceeding quietly. As Klaus reached for the crate, Mr. Jensen spoke, his voice deep and friendly. He reached into a cooler and pulled out something wrapped in white butcher paper. He handed the small package directly to Klaus. "Here, son. You boys have a long day. Don't tell Mitch, but this one's on the house," he offered with kindness. Klaus stared at the package, unable to compute the gesture. He stood frozen, convinced it was a test, a trap, waiting for the hidden cruelty to appear. He opened the paper slowly. Inside was a thick slice of freshly baked ham, cured and still warm, rich with fat. It was a portion easily equivalent to a week's ration in Germany, a luxury offered with a handshake and a smile, a shocking betrayal of the rules of war. Klaus instinctively pulled back, stammering out something about not being able to accept the valuable gift. But Mr. Jensen clapped him gently on the shoulder and winked. "Go on. Eat it. You look like you need the protein, son." The moment was profoundly destabilizing. This small, generous act, given freely, was a moral contradiction that trumped every piece of propaganda. The butcher was not gloating. He was simply offering a gift based on the simple premise of shared humanity and simple courtesy, a total inversion of what was expected. Klaus, rigid with confusion, took a hesitant bite. The flavor was an explosion of forgotten pleasure. It was the purest proof that the war the Reich was fighting was against a civilization of limitless capacity and baffling goodwill from its people. Mitch and Mr. Jensen were already deep in conversation about a baseball team. The shock was in the apathy. They saw Klaus not as a hated enemy, but merely as a young man working under the hot sun, another necessary worker. As the truck finally pulled away, Klaus held the paper-wrapped ham tightly. That piece of food was not just sustenance. It was a physical artifact of the lie he had been told, and he knew he could never again pledge his loyalty to a regime that had deliberately starved its own people for a false cause. That night, the barracks at Camp Stockton offered no comfort to Klaus Richter. He sat on his cot, not physically bound, but ensnared by the invisible, powerful chain of truth. The taste of Mr. Jensen's ham was now a moral poison dissolving everything he had ever been taught and held dear by his family. The internal conflict was a private, silent battle, more intense than any firefight. On one side stood Sergeant Dietz, the zealous ideologue who represented Klaus's past, the loyalty, the honor, the old pride. Dietz and his clique loudly dismissed the American generosity as a calculated sign of weakness, saying they lacked resolve. Dietz would declare, "They try to soften us, but we know the truth. They are crumbling and just using tricks to break our will." But Klaus knew Dietz was wrong. The image of the Stockton meats and provisions window defied all intellectual gymnastics. He had seen the truth. The prosperity was not fragile, it was unshakable. The abundance wasn't a trick. It was the casual byproduct of an economic system operating on a scale that rendered scarcity obsolete across the entire country. Klaus tried cautiously to share his revelation. He mentioned the 5 pounds of beef the housewife had ordered. His comrades sneered. To acknowledge American prosperity meant admitting that their own sacrifice had been rooted in a monstrous lie that cost millions of lives. Isolated by his knowledge, Klaus began to feel profoundly alone. He realized the greatest challenge was enduring the moral isolation from his own men. They were still fighting the propaganda war in their cramped heads, refusing the reality before their eyes. He began spending his evenings alone trying to teach himself English from an old dictionary. He needed facts, not dogma. He started counting the passing trains, marveling at the sheer volume of material being moved effortlessly across the vast landscape. Klaus slowly realized the real picture. America was powerful because of organization and confidence in its massive systems. The generosity was the luxury of a secure civilization that did not need to resort to the cruelty of a desperate, cornered one. He finally understood the ultimate failure of the Reich. They had chosen delusion over reality, sealing their fate and the fate of their nation. The choice before Klaus was stark: cling to the powerful lie and maintain his loyalty, or embrace the terrifying truth that could set his mind free, even in captivity. The next opportunity to write home, to the mother who still believed the propaganda, would be the final test of his painful knowledge and his new resolve. The official camp stationery was thin, rough paper, designed to reveal any attempts at invisible ink. For weeks, Klaus had avoided the required letter writing, but the desire to reach his mother with a single fragment of truth had become an absolute imperative, outweighing his fear of censorship. The night of the letter writing, the barracks were silent. The rule was simple, one page, heavily censored. For Klaus, the challenge was in concealing the truth of American abundance while betraying the propaganda. This required an intellectual act of treason against his old world and his former loyalties and indoctrination. He began the usual formalities, writing that he was healthy and the camp orderly. But then, he strategically chose his words. He wrote about the vastness of the California landscape, suggesting limitless territory and resources, far beyond Germany's limits. He wrote that the work was honest, underscoring that he was treated as a worker, not a slave, receiving fair treatment. His greatest hurdle was the food. He wrote that the bread was white and provided daily. He described the coffee as plentiful. He wrote, "Mother, the sun shines here every day and the food comes not from a ration book but from the ground itself in a quantity you would not believe," hoping she understood the coded message hidden within. He devoted a careful paragraph to the uniforms. He wrote that the American soldiers and civilians wore clothes that were sturdy, new, and showed no sign of rationing or shortage. He subtly contrasted this outward image of prosperity with the worn garments back home, which was a clear signal of the true economic difference. But the real kernel of his message was the absence of hatred. He wrote, "The men here are not what the papers told us. They are not cruel, they are practical. They treat us with an odd kind of courtesy and respect." This simple observation was a direct contradiction to the demonization that had fueled the war. When the letter was finished, Klaus reread it, feeling a profound intellectual surrender. He had written a coded message of betrayal against the Reich, not through anger, but through a quiet testimony to the reality of the butcher shop and the overwhelming material truth. The next morning, Klaus quietly dropped the folded paper into the official mailbag. The letter would be stamped by the censor, but he knew the message it carried, a truthful seed of American prosperity, was already on its slow journey across the vast ocean, destined for his mother's hands. He could only hope that it would reach his mother and plant the same painful doubt in her heart. Weeks turned into months under the California sun, and Klaus Richter's work detail outside the wire evolved into an unscheduled education. He was no longer a prisoner merely forced to work. He had become a quiet, intense student of the enemy he was taught to despise, learning their true nature through observation and interaction. The greatest difference, Klaus realized, was not in machines but in their philosophy of labor. In Germany, work was a grim duty, driven by fear. In Stockton, it was a source of pride and innovation. Mitch and the local hands were not driven by fervor, but by a simple, competitive desire for efficiency and respect for their output. They worked hard, always seeking the quickest way to complete a task, maximizing the time spent and resources used. They treated their equipment, their massive tractors and sturdy trucks, not as scarce resources, but as necessary tools of a profitable trade, easily replaced if necessary. Klaus watched Mitch's casual authority with astonishment. Mitch commanded through example, not shouting. He treated the prisoners like men who understood the value of a completed job. If a tool broke, the solution was not a lecture, but a quick trip for a new part. A small, recurring act of abundance that spoke volumes about the nation's wealth and industrial base. He seized every opportunity to practice his English. He would ask Mitch questions not about the war, but about mundane American life. The price of land, the rules of baseball. Mitch, amused by the Germans' curiosity, would answer, unconsciously dismantling years of totalitarian dogma one question at a time, and with great patience. The more Klaus saw, the clearer the picture became. The power of America was not a brutal militarism. It was a decentralized, confident, and overwhelming practicality. The country's wealth was so vast it could wage a global war while simultaneously supplying its civilians and feeding its captured enemies lavishly. The Stockton Meats and Provisions window was the inevitable product of this machine reflecting its power. Klaus viewed the old propaganda posters as childish, the desperate hallucinations of a regime that could not admit the truth. The ultimate failure of the Reich was intellectual. They had chosen delusion over reality, a choice they could not recover from, and that cost them everything. His final lesson came from a local farmer, a neighbor of Mitch's who stopped by and simply brought them a cooler full of ice-cold Coca-Cola. He didn't offer a sermon. He just offered a cold drink on a hot day, a simple human gesture. It was a gesture of simple, matter-of-fact humanity. Klaus tasted the sugary fizz, an American phenomenon. He knew then that the defeat of his old world was not coming through a battle, but through this quiet, practical kindness. He was ready to carry this uncomfortable, undeniable truth back to a world that desperately needed to hear it. The workday on that mild April morning in 1945 ended not with the setting sun, but with a summons from the camp commander. The sound of Mitch's old pickup rattling to a stop felt like the sound of history accelerating toward its final conclusion. Mitch, normally easygoing, was solemn as he delivered the news. He held a newspaper screaming that Germany had surrendered. For Klaus and his comrades, the word hung heavy, a final unceremonious punctuation mark on their history. There was no joy, only a profound emptiness at the world's ending and the loss of purpose. The American processing began immediately. Trucks arrived at Camp Stockton for repatriation. As Klaus packed his dictionary and sketch of the butcher shop, he realized he was leaving America a different person. The man who arrived expected to be ended. The man who left had been saved by the enemy's generosity, which was the greatest irony and source of his transformation. Mitch came to the barracks one last time. He approached Klaus, nodding. "You worked hard, German. Good luck. Take care of yourself." He handed Klaus a small paper bag containing actual American chocolate. Mitch gave Klaus something else, a small framed postcard depicting the prosperous main street of Stockton. "So you don't forget," Mitch mumbled, quickly walking away, avoiding a tearful farewell which was difficult for both men. When the ship finally arrived in a gray, shell-damaged Bremerhaven, the contrast was stark. Where Stockton had been whole, his homeland was shattered, the streets rivers of rubble. The truth of the lie was confirmed by the sight of his own country ravaged by war. But in the ruins, Klaus carried the picture of Stockton and the memory of Mr. Jensen's ham. He had seen the truth of an enemy whose strength was matched by its casual decency. He used his English to become a translator for the Allied occupation forces. He told his story of the butcher shop, the overflowing food, to anyone who would listen and would receive the message. Klaus Richter became one of the thousands of former prisoners who carried the seed of reconciliation back to Germany. He became a living contradiction to the Reich's lies. He showed people the picture of Stockton, explaining that the enemy was not a monster, but a powerful civilization that chose respect over vengeance. His journey began with fear on a dark cargo ship, but it ended with hope on the rubble-strewn docks of his homeland. The ultimate lesson of the war was won not on the battlefield, but in the casual, confident decency of a single American street and its ordinary inhabitants. If this incredible true story of wartime humanity and shattered propaganda amazed you, hit the like button and subscribe. We bring you the most unbelievable but true moments in history every week.